Before I pass it on, just a little bit about Necia, our host. Necia Quast is a retired Department of State Foreign Service officer from Washington State. She has a degree in international relations from American University and attended the University of Washington and University of Southern California. She served in the State Department for over 26 years as an economics officer and served 8 overseas posts with her final tour of duty as Deputy Chief of Mission in Tajikistan. She was economic counselor in Ukraine from the summer of 2002 to 2005 and was there during the Orange Revolution. She retired to San Juan Island in 2011, and she speaks Russian and Ukrainian. And with that, I will pass it off to you, Necia, if you're ready to go.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so the lecture is Ukraine's history with Russia. It's complicated. And since I'm trying to cram over 1,000 years of history into about an hour, I'm going to jump right into it and get started. So if you're like me, before I learned Ukrainian history, even though I studied Russian and Russian history in college, if you asked me about Ukrainian history, I would probably say, well, I think it was part of the Soviet Union, and before that, it was probably part of the Russian Empire. It turns out it's a whole lot more interesting and a whole lot more complicated than that. Russia and Ukraine do have a long entwined history and culture, and hopefully knowing some of that history will help you make your own judgment about Putin's claim that Ukraine is not a real country, but an integral part of Russia. Although ultimately, I think anybody's opinion on that doesn't matter. Ukraine legally became an independent nation in 1991. And in 1994, when Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons, Russia, along with the United States and the United Kingdom, gave written security assurances for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, a couple of the caveats. One, because I'm cramming a huge amount of history into a very short amount of time, that means that I'm simplifying everything to a very large degree. This leaves out a lot of complicated twists and turns, and so nuance and interesting and important bits will be left out of this. Also, I'm familiar with this history, but I'm not a historian and I'm not a deep expert on this history. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge that I have a personal bias towards the Ukrainian view. I lived and worked in Ukraine for 3 years. I have never actually been to Russia proper. Although I have served in 3 post-Soviet countries, I served in East Germany when it was part of the Warsaw Pact, and I visited many other post-Soviet countries, but not Ukraine itself. However, when we're talking about the history, the general outline is agreed upon by Ukrainians and Russians, but they have a different spin on that history. And I'm very familiar with both the Ukrainian view of that history and the Russian view of that history. And as we get to the end, I will look back at some of these bits of history that we go through and explain where Ukrainians and Russians differ on that. Then there's a couple of background pieces of information I would like you to keep in mind as we go through this history. One is that Ukraine occupies the richest agricultural land in Europe and is very resource rich. Some of you may have heard about how Russia's blocking of Ukraine's food exports is one of the major causes for global food shortages. Secondly, Ukraine is mostly flat. It's easy to invade. It's difficult to defend and hold. For nearly all of its history, Ukrainian territory has been divided among different ruling states and empires, the borders changing constantly, and different pieces of it changing hands frequently. Up until World War II, most of the population were peasants, with each ruling state was sort of granting land to their nobility. but the peasants on the ground were maintaining their own culture and language. And the last thing is I just want to make a note on the name of Ukraine and what the territory was called. So in the western part of Ukraine, Ukrainian territory was often referred to as Ruthenia and Ukrainians as Ruthenians. This comes from an early state, a principality that was called Ruthenia, and it derives from the word Rus. The word Ukraine itself is from a Slavic word, Okraina, which means borderlands. To start with, also, I want to just help you locate, orientate where Ukraine is in Europe. So let's see. Suddenly my mouse isn't working. I was going to zoom in a little bit. But since I can't, we'll stick. Anyway, you can see Ukraine is part of, Ukraine has Russia to the east and northeast. It has Belarus to the northwest. To the due west, it borders with Poland, with Slovakia, and with Hungary. To the southwest with Romania and Moldova, directly to the south, to the Black Sea, and across the Black Sea is Turkey. Now I want to orientate you on Ukraine's current outlines, and you'll be looking at a lot of different maps, and it won't always be clear to you what is Ukraine. So I want to point out a couple of things to watch for. So the main feature is the Dnipro River, which cuts through and cuts Ukraine roughly in half into an eastern and a western half. You'll notice that it goes southeast, then it curves and goes directly south for a bit before cutting back southwest. So these two curves in the river are sort of key things to look for to orient yourself. Of course, the Crimean Peninsula and the Sea of Azov are other key geographical features that you can see on all of the maps. Then this is where Kiev is located, on the river to the north. Chernobyl is almost due north of Kiev, right on the border with Belarus. Luhansk and Donetsk in the east are the two territories that Russia has been moving towards annexing, that have been a little bit longer under Russian control than some other parts of the country. Mariupol, which has been in the news, is right there. Odessa, which most people have heard of, the major Black Sea port, is there. And Lviv, sort of the farthest west major city, is there. Okay, now the key segments of Ukrainian history that I'm going to run through are, first of all, the foundational state of Kievan Rus, which was a loose confederation of Slavic, Finnic, and Baltic principalities that existed from 1879 to 1240 and was run by a Viking Nordic aristocracy. Kiev Rus collapsed in 1240 when the Mongol invasion occurred. And from 1241 to 1648, for those next 4 centuries, the territory that's modern Ukraine came to be divided among Poland and Lithuania, Russians, and the Ottoman Empire. In 1648, Ukrainian Cossacks rose up to throw off Polish rule and established a state that was called the Hetmanate, which became a vassal state of Russia, then eventually was absorbed into Russia in the late 18th century. And between that point and World War I, a large chunk of Ukraine was dominated by Russia, which started to begin to try to erase Ukrainian culture. But the far western part of Ukraine became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So in 1917, during World War I, you had the collapse of the Russian Empire. You also had the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ukraine briefly declared independence, but ended up being one of the national republics in the Soviet Union, and then had quite a stormy history in its early days as part of the Soviet Union. Then in World War II, Ukraine was occupied by Nazi Germany for 4 years, and then at the end of the war, the Western Ukrainian territory was absorbed into the Soviet Union, and all of modern Ukraine came under the rule of one political entity for the first time in its history. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine became independent, and for the first 2 decades of its modern independence, had a policy of balancing the relationship between East and West. In the most recent decade, that balance started to move westward, and Russia began to react to that, bringing us to 2022, when Russia increased its threat and eventually invaded Ukraine. So this is Kievan Rus in its highlight. This map is from 1054. Just again, to orient you a little bit, this actually has the outline of modern Ukraine right here. So you can see Eastern Ukraine was not part of Kievan Rus, but most of Western and Central Ukraine was all part of Kievan Rus. This right here is modern Belarus, and most of this up here is Russian territory. But this southern bit here was not part of Kievan Rus, and its capital was in Kiev. So Kievan Rus was founded in the 9th century by the Viking leader Oleg, who came down from Novgorod, was the first major East Slavonic state. It was a loose confederation of Slavic, Baltic, and Finnish polities. In the next century, the dominating Rurik dynasty was established. Prince Volodymyr the Great in 988 decided to adopt monotheism. He had a representative from the Greek Orthodox Church in Byzantium, from the Catholic Church in Rome, and a Muslim all come and present their case to him. And he decided, he chose Orthodox Christianity. The whole of Kievan Rus converted to Orthodox Christianity, and the Byzantine Church established the Metropolitan in Kiev and all of Rus to oversee the spiritual life of the Orthodox Christians in Kievan Rus. The next century was the golden age of Kievan Rus, especially under Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, who ruled from 1019 to 1054. The map that we saw was from 1054 at the end of his reign. And during this period, Kiev was Eastern Europe's political and cultural center. Also, through the 11th century, the ruling dynasty was still speaking Old Norse. It was still very much a Viking-ruled state. But in the 12th century, as the principalities and their ruling clans became richer, the population of the states grew, they became more powerful and independent, and they also began to become Slavicized. They'd been intermarrying with Slavs. The leadership had been intermarrying with leading Slavic families for the last couple of centuries, but they started now to speak the Slavic language instead of Old Norse. And also the central control from Kiev was diminishing as each of the principalities was getting stronger. And it was starting to fragment a bit. Then in the 13th century, the Mongol invasion came between 1237 and by 1240, Kievan Rus collapsed into the individual principalities, most of whom became vassal states to the Golden Horde, which was the leadership of the Mongol invasion, and paid tribute to that Golden Horde. So after the collapse of Kievan Rus, the succeeding centuries see the rise of 3 powerful expansionary state combinations that conquer Ukrainian territory between them. So in 41, immediately after the collapse of Kievan Rus, the Rurik dynasty is ruling the northern and eastern principalities under vassalage to the Golden Horde. And in 1263, one of those principalities creates a new duchy within it of Moscow for the son of one of the leaders. So at the time that Kievan Rus collapsed, Moscow had not yet been established. Then in 1299, the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus relocated to Vladimir in one of the principalities of Vladimir Suzdal, and then in 1325 relocated to Moscow as Kiev and the western portions of the old Rus territories were under pressure, and war was being waged from Lithuania. And eventually Poland and Lithuania formed a joint commonwealth. They pushed east, and the joint commonwealth annexed all of western and northern Ukrainian territory. In 1441, the Tatars in Crimea, who had originally been part of the Golden Horde, broke away and created the Crimean Khanate, which included not just the Crimean Peninsula, but also most of southern Ukraine. And in 1475, the Crimean Khanate became part of the Ottoman Empire. By 1547, the Duchy of Moscow, also known as Muscovy, had grown increasingly powerful and had absorbed all of those remaining northern Rus principalities. And Ivan IV, who was still a descendant of the Rurik dynasty, took the title of Tsar of all Russia, started to call Russia an empire, and began a huge territorial expansion, mostly to the east and to the south. So Russian expansion reached the Pacific Ocean before it reached Kiev. Then in 1595 in Poland, the Uniate Church was formed. Catholic Rome and Byzantium came to an agreement, and in a number of places, Catholic and Orthodox Christians were united under Roman oversight, but kept their Eastern rights. These are called Uniate churches, and many Western Ukrainians became Uniates. So this was the situation until the next big event, which in 1648 was a Cossack uprising led by Cossack leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky. So this is artistic rendition of him entering Kiev. And now I'm going to show you a couple of maps to give you the idea of the situation in the run-up. So let's see. So I'm going to zoom in just on the Ukrainian portion. So all of that was in yellow was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And here is the Dnieper River. Here is Kiev. So the Poland, Lithuania controlled Ukrainian territory, everything certainly west of the Dnieper River, a fair ways to the east of the Dnieper River, down kind of to just below that second bend in the river. This part of southern Ukraine is part of the Ottoman Empire, including Donetsk and Luhansk is part of the Ottoman Empire at this point. Here is where Lviv is, kind of the eastern fringe of Ukrainian territory where it's running up against Polish territory. And this is Russia. So that, again, so that is what the situation, the territorial situation between Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and Polish and Lithuania in 1648. However, it's not that simple. And this map shows in yellow what were called the wild fields or the borderlands, which was territory occupied and controlled by Cossacks. And it was allowed by these three surrounding countries that technically included this territory within their boundaries as a buffer zone among them. At this point, everybody was fighting each other. a lot. And the Cossacks created a buffer zone between the Tatars attacking north into Poland and into Russia, and also helped keep the Poles and the Russians from fighting each other. So even though on paper these were all part of these three countries, in practice, this territory was controlled by Cossacks. The Cossacks were divided into hordes. There was the Don Horde based over on the Don River, and the Don Horde is usually referred to Russian Cossacks, but the larger and more powerful one was the Zaporizhian Horde, with their headquarters here, and who were the Ukrainian Cossacks. Now, question is, who exactly were the Cossacks? So the Cossacks were a nomadic group, horseback nomads, but ethnically mostly Slav. They're believed to have been originally formed mostly by runaway slaves, runaway serfs, runaway peasants. They had actually quite an organized society. They liked hunting and fishing and fighting and partying, but they had a democratic society. They had a council called a Rada, a representative council called a Rada. The Rada would elect from among them a leader called the Hetman. They had courts and administration. They also had a lot of free trade. They had a lot of merchants allowed in there. And in 1648, the Cossacks rose up to throw Polish rule off of Ukrainian territory. So I'm just going to go back to this map. So, a big chunk of what was Poland and Lithuania was already essentially controlled by the Cossacks, but they moved up into all of this territory and took Kiev, went to all of these cities and fought battles. And took over, kicked out the Poles. Also, a lot of the people killed in these battles were Jewish tenants of Polish landlords, and it's sometimes considered the first pogrom. Initially, the Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, were supporting the Cossacks in this battle, but then they began to turn against them and attack them from the rear. And in 1654, with the Poles trying to reestablish control and the Tatars attacking them from the rear, the Hetmanate signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav with the Russian Empire for Russia's help in staving off Polish recontrol. And the initial agreement gave the Hetmanate local autonomy, but in return they owed troops to Russia and loyalty to Russia and wouldn't fight against Russia. The next 50 years were extremely unstable for this whole time. Khmelnytsky died in 1657. After that, the Cossacks began to fight among themselves over leadership. Russia and Poland were fighting each other back and forth over territory. And eventually in 1667, the Russians and Poles signed a treaty which gave them joint administration of the Hetmanate, or joint oversight of the Hetmanate. And in 1688, they actually divided it between them along the Dnieper River, and Russia had oversight of the left bank or eastern side of the Hetmanate, and Poland had control of the west side of the border. In 1702, the leader of the Polish side of the Hetmanate led a revolt against Polish rule, which failed. It failed partly because the Russian, in the Russian half of the Hetmanate, Russian overseen half of the Hetmanate, the leader Jan Mazeppa helped put down that revolt, and he became the hetman of the whole Hetmanate again. But then a few years later, Peter the Great decided that he needed to bring the Hetmanate under his control, and especially the Cossack troops closer under his control. And Mazeppa himself led an uprising attempting to free the Eastern Hetmanate from Russia. That failed, and the Russian troops razed the Zaporizhian siege capital in reprisal, and the Hetmanate's autonomy starts to begin to be eroded bit by bit going forward until eventually in 1764, it was abolished entirely and was replaced by what was called the Little Russia Governorate. Okay, so between 1764 and up until 1917, we see Russia expanding further into Ukrainian territory and consolidating its political control. So in 1764, Russia won a war against Turkey, which was one reason they went ahead and abolished the Hetmanate, is because they no longer needed the support of Cossack troops in their fights against Turkey. And in addition, they conquered all of the Crimean Khanate land except for the Crimean Peninsula itself, most of what is southern Ukraine, and created a new Russian province called Novorossiya. And they took bits of the Little Russia part of the Hetmanate and added that to Novorossiya as well. Then a major thing that happened is between 1772 and 1795, Poland disappears from the map as it's partitioned between Prussia, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire over the next 23 years. And I'm going to briefly go to a map that shows that. So the green is territory that was given to Russia in the three partitions. The blue is Prussia, which we're not very interested in. And the yellow is parts that went to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And again, I'm going to zoom in on the Ukrainian part. So the initial one didn't give Russia any significant territory on Ukrainian territory, except for a little bit right there. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire took most of Western Ukraine. In the second partition, the Russian Empire pushes its territory from the Dnipro River across and takes about 2/3 of the western part of Ukraine. And then in the last partition, Russia gains this little triangle that's left between them and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So at the end of that, Russia has the bulk now of Ukrainian territory, except for Crimea and that far 1/3 of Western Ukraine. In 1775, they again raised the Zaporizhian Sich, which had been rebuilt in the meantime, and its territory was moved out of Little Russia into the Novorossiya province. And then in 1781, they annexed all of Little Russia to be part of Russia proper and no longer any kind of separately recognized territory. And in 1783, annexed the Crimean Peninsula. The other thing that was going on during this time was from 1791 to 1917 is the Pale of Jewish settlement was maintained in western parts of the Russian Empire. And we're again going to go to a map. So basically, Jews were not allowed to live or settle in Russia proper, but they were allowed to live and settle in these territories that Russia had acquired in these Polish partitions. And over time, they pushed the border of that Pale of settlement further west. So it wasn't static for that whole period. And so you'll tend to see the areas with higher Jewish population are further to the west. But, we hear a lot about Russian Jews, but actually until the Soviet Union was formed, Jews weren't actually allowed in sort of the core part of Russia. And then the other thing that was going on during this time was suppression of Ukrainian language and culture, initially both in Western and Russian territory, but later the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not begin to end that policy. But in Russia itself, dozens of laws and decrees banned the Ukrainian language. Ukrainian language was banned. It couldn't be, schools couldn't be taught in Ukrainian, religious services couldn't be carried out in Ukrainian, nothing could be printed or published in the Ukrainian language. And this is the value web circular of 1863 that said the Ukrainian language never existed, doesn't exist, and cannot exist. But the fact that they were banning it every 2 or 3 years seems to make one think it probably did in fact exist. Then during the 19th century, also during this period, there was sort of a Ukrainian cultural awakening going on in both parts of Ukrainian territory. Some key events were in 1848, the Austro-Hungary authorities began to support Ruthenian national identity to balance Polish nationalism and began to establish schools teaching the Ukrainian language, allowed Ruthenian political parties to be founded, and a general flowering of Ukrainian culture. This is just a picture of Lviv, which is, the leading city of Western Ukraine, and was and has been for centuries. Meanwhile, in Russia in 1847, this chap, Taras Shevchenko, who was an artist, and that's a self-portrait, but he was also a poet, a historian, an ethnographer, a member of the Russian Academy of Arts. And in 1847, he was convicted and exiled for explicitly promoting the independence of Ukraine and for writing poems in the Ukrainian language. And he's considered a Ukrainian hero to this day. And also one of the people responsible for making Ukrainian into a literary language as opposed to, just the language mostly used by peasants. So that brings us up to World War I. In 1917, there was the Communist Revolution and the collapse of the Russian Empire. Ukrainians immediately set up a Central Rada Council in Kiev. In March of 1918, the very new and weak Russian government ceded most of Ukrainian territory to Germany. However, in October, Germany itself collapsed and Ukraine declared independence. In fact, several versions of Ukraine declared independence, several rival governments, and civil war ensued. In fact, there was civil war all over the Soviet Union. The civil war continued up until about 1922, when the Russian army conquered about 2/3 of Ukraine and established the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The western third of Ukraine was divided up among the new Central European states that came out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Part of it was in Poland, part of it was in Czechoslovakia, part of it was in Hungary, and part of it was in Romania. In the 1920s, the new Soviet state, which is still really trying to get its feet on the ground and very much needed Ukraine on board, encouraged Ukrainian language and culture as long as they were sticking within the communist bounds. That changed in the 1930s when Stalin came into office and Ukrainian language and culture were again suppressed. And then in 1932 to 1933, during Stalin's collectivization campaign, millions of Ukrainians died in a man-made famine known as the Holodomor, or Great Starvation. That picture is the Holodomor monument that's in Washington, D.C. The next major event was in 1939. Western Ukraine was annexed by the Soviet Union when they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Nazis, and they partitioned the land of Central Europe between them, and the Soviet Union got that western part of Ukraine that had been part of Austria-Hungary up until that point. However, in 1941, the Nazis set aside the pact and invaded the Soviet Union, especially Ukraine and Belarus, which obviously were on the western edge. And the Nazis occupied Ukraine until 1944. Over 5 million Ukrainians died in the fighting in that period, and 1.5 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Also during this this period, the Ukrainian insurgent army came together out of initially resistance groups that then began to be guerrilla fighters. They were fighting to throw off they were fighting against the Nazis, but they were also fighting to try to avoid Soviet domination. And sometimes they fought with the Nazis, sometimes they fought against the Nazis. In 1944, the Soviet Union again reoccupied Ukrainian territory, and Stalin deported 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Siberia and Central Asia, falsely accusing them of collaboration with the Nazis. In 1945, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic got a separate constitution and also became a founding member of the UN. And also that year, the last little bit of Western Ukraine, Zakarpattia, was annexed from Hungary. And in 1946, they had still been fighting over Lviv, and Lviv was annexed from Poland into the Soviet Union. In the 50s, things improved for Ukraine as Khrushchev became the party chairman. He was very favorable towards Ukraine. And on the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav to celebrate 300 years of Russian-Ukrainian union, he transferred the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Also, it wasn't until 1954 that the Soviets finally managed to eradicate the Ukrainian insurgent army, which had been fighting against them and also sometimes against Poland ever since the German invasion. In 1964, when Brezhnev came in, the Russification policy came back in. Ukrainian language was suppressed again. Throughout the Soviet Union, there was increased covert opposition to Soviet rule, leading to repression of dissidents, mainly intellectuals. In 1972, a lot of that fell on Ukrainians. Then kind of quiet years, except for there was very briefly Ukrainian party chairman, Chernenko, who didn't make much of a mark. By 1986, we were into the Gorbachev and the Glasnost era, when a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power station exploded, sending a radioactive plume across Europe, and also set off a huge wave of environmental activism, actually, both in Western Europe and throughout the Soviet Union. The Soviet authorities allowed this. They saw this as a non-political way for people to blow off steam and to have their say. And the Soviet Union on the books actually was very pro-environmental, even though their practice wasn't. So it wasn't seen as a political issue. But over time, these environmental movements began to take on a nationalist characteristic in many places. This accelerated when, in the period of 1989 to 1990, the Eastern European countries of the Warsaw Pact threw off communist rule. And so the nationalist events going on also begin to affect the Soviet republics, and many of those environmental movements began to take on a nationalist bent, including in the Baltics. And in fact, increasing nationalism in the Baltics led to the attempted coup in Moscow and the breakup of the Soviet Union, at which point Ukraine, along with several other republics, declared independence, and 92% of the population supported independence on the referendum about that. So in the post-independence period, the picture here is the first day of the Orange Revolution. For the first 2 decades, Ukraine had a policy of trying to balance its relationships between the East and the West, between Russia and Europe. One of the early things that happened in the 1990s were about 250,000 Crimean Tatars who'd been exiled out to Siberia, returned to Crimea. In 1994, they had presidential elections, and Leonid Kuchma, who was a factory leader and considered somewhat of a technocrat, won the election, replacing Leonid Kravchuk, who'd been the Communist Party chairman, who became the first president. And he had a policy of trying to balance overtures to the West with alliance with Russia. In 1996, they adopted a new democratic constitution that included term limits of 2 5-year terms for the president, and a new currency. So they stopped using the ruble and established their own currency. By 2002, Putin has become the new president in Russia. Russia's taking a more nationalist approach. The general elections produced a hung parliament. Some of the opposition parties allege electoral fraud. Now, this is a few months. I got to Ukraine in the summer of 2002. I would say all of the time that I was in Ukraine, the population was very evenly divided between those who favored staying close to Russia and those who favored moving more towards Europe. And it was very hard with this very even division for either side to get a solid majority or the upper hand. And so a hung parliament to me wasn't surprising at all. I think that reflected the actual sort of grassroots political position. But with Russia taking a more aggressive line in May of 2002, the government formally applied to join NATO. In 2004, the term limits under the Constitution, Kuchma can't run for president again. He selects Viktor Yanukovych as his designated successor. He makes him the prime minister, and Yanukovych runs for president. Meanwhile, Viktor Yushchenko, who is a former prime minister, and before that, the head of the National Bank, founded a pro-Western party called Our Ukraine, and they were the two main contenders for the presidential party. And when they had the presidential elections, it looked the sense on the ground, there was a huge election observation going on, was that Viktor Yushchenko had a small but definitive lead in the vote. And the election commission announced results that made Viktor Yanukovych the winner. And immediately a huge protest rose up in the streets of Kiev over the rigged elections. The Supreme Court, suits were filed to overturn the elections. The intelligence service released recordings of conversations between Yanukovych's campaign manager and the head of the election commission of them discussing how they would announce false results, making Yanukovych the winner. And with that evidence out there and very, very public, the Supreme Court had little choice. They annulled the election results. They did not declare Yushchenko the winner. However, they declared a rerun. And in December, the election was rerun, and Yushchenko won those, and he was inaugurated in January. But in 2005, so in 2006, the Socialist Party, which initially had been in a coalition with Yushchenko's party, switched sides and joined Yanukovych's party of the regions. That made it pretty hard for the government to accomplish anything. And in 2010, at the next presidential elections, Viktor Yanukovych won legitimately this time. I think people were fed up that the government wasn't able to accomplish much, wasn't able to form a solid majority in parliament, and parliament voted to abandon the NATO membership bid. So the next decade sees a turning point to the west. This is a picture from the 2013-2014 Maidan revolution, which set off the chain of events, I think, that leads directly to today. Security forces killed protesters in this, and President Yanukovych fled to Russia. So with Yanukovych in power, Russia was much more blatantly interfering in Ukrainian political affairs, seemed to be calling the shots. Things came to a head in 2013 when Ukraine had negotiated an association agreement with the EU. The parliament passed it with a 2/3 majority, and Yanukovych announced that he was not going to sign the agreement. And it was clear he made that decision because Putin had pressured him not to sign it. So protests started. This was in late November. It started. Protests continued throughout the winter, and they hadn't gone away. In February, the government decided to use force to try to end the protest. They set up snipers, and at least 77 and perhaps as many as 150 protesters were killed. Instead of causing the protest to dissipate, this actually supercharged them. As soon as people heard on TV and the radio that the government was shooting at protesters, more people flooded into the streets. The protests became much larger, much angrier, and Yanukovych fled to Russia. And the parliament elected a new interim government and declared new presidential elections. Putin called it a coup. And in the following month, Russian forces annexed Crimea, which prompted the biggest East-West showdown since the Cold War. Part of the reason for the showdown was, as I mentioned early on, Russia had signed an agreement guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. And the US and the UK had also signed that same agreement. So now you have Russia violating Ukraine's territorial integrity, and the US and the UK are signatories to the agreement to defend it. Since those were all nuclear powers, none of them actually wanted to get into a war. And there were just, there were UN resolutions, there were some sanctions, but there was no fighting around the annexation of Crimea. Then in the following month, not to rest on his laurels, Russian armed groups seized parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, and the Ukrainian government launched military operations against these armed groups. These groups are often referred to as Russian-backed Ukrainian separatists. In fact, most of them are what Ukrainians refer to as the little green men. This picture is from Crimea. These are soldiers in fatigues, but wearing masks. They have no insignia, no identification, which is a violation of international law. And they're basically Russian troops, but they don't identify them as Russian troops. And the little green men were active in these groups that seized Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as Crimea. So in the following month in May, businessman Petro Poroshenko won the presidential election on a pro-Western platform. The parliamentary elections in the fall produced a strong pro-Western majority. In December, there was a cyber attack from Russia, which shut down Ukraine's power grid. In July of 2017, Ukraine's association agreement with the European Union was finally ratified. In 2018, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople allowed the Ukrainian Church to break away from oversight of the Russian Orthodox Church. And in 2019, television comedian Zelensky won the presidential election runoff in a landslide over Petro Poroshenko, and his Servant of the People Party won the parliamentary elections. One notable thing about this, up until this point, if there had been a runoff, one of the candidates would have been a pro-Russian candidate and one would have been a pro-Western candidate. In this case, neither candidate is a pro-Russian candidate. Zelensky ran mainly on an anti-corruption platform, but this is the first time there's no pro-Russian leading presidential candidate. And that sets the stage for today. when in 2021, the Russians began to bring up troops on all of its borders with Ukraine, and in February of 2022, invaded. Now for the wrap up, so Ukraine has not yet perished. That's the title of the Ukrainian national anthem. If you do a word for word translation, it's Ukraine is not dead yet, but it's usually translated a little more poetically. The picture I have here, I thought was maybe a little symbolic of Ukraine's history. It's the Uspensky Cathedral, which was built during the time of Kievan Rus. It was destroyed by the Soviet Army in 1941, and then it was rebuilt in independent Ukraine in 1998 to 2000. And now I want to do a little what I promised at the beginning, which is to talk a little bit about how Ukraine and Russia differ and how they look at these, look at this history. So starting with Kiev Rus, that is very important to Russia's story about why Ukraine is part of Russia. While both Ukraine and Russia, as well as Belarus, Ukraine and Belarus consider themselves successor states to Kievan Rus, Russia considers itself the successor state to Kievan Rus. And because Ivan IV, who established Russia, was still part of the Rurik dynasty, because the Metropolitan of Kiev had moved to Moscow, Russia considers itself to have some kind of divine right over any territory that was part of the original Kievan Rus. From the Ukrainian point of view, they definitely had a shared history for that period of Kievan Rus. However, when Kievan Rus collapsed, Moscow wasn't even a thing at that point, and they see their histories as diverging after the collapse of Kievan Rus, with most of the parts of Rus that became Russia having a closer relationship with the Mongol horde. A lot of people feel that Russian culture took on what they call some Oriental tendencies, some authoritarian tendencies from the Mongols. Meanwhile, much of the Ukrainian territory was under a somewhat more liberal Polish rule. A big chunk of it became part of Cossack society, which was much more democratic and freewheeling, if occasionally feckless and not very focused. And so they feel at that point their history and their culture diverge. And then when we come up to the Treaty of Pereyaslav, which the Russians and the Ukrainians began fighting about what exactly that treaty said within several years of it being signed, and have been arguing about it ever since. The Russians look at it as they're coming to the aid of their Orthodox brothers, protecting them from being reabsorbed into Poland, giving them autonomy, and generally being a very helpful big brother. And Ukrainians look at it as the time that they turned to their Orthodox brothers for help, and eventually were betrayed, stabbed in the back, and absorbed into the Russian Empire against their will. Russians look at the Soviet period as a period when, both Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, when they finally managed to unite all Ukrainian territory under one political polity and creating, the modern Ukrainian state as we know it, and think that the Ukrainians are ungrateful. The Ukrainians, certainly Western Ukraine, which was never part of any part of Russian territory until World War II, doesn't feel like it really has that big of a connection to Russia. And even the rest of Ukraine, feels like that Soviet history was a very mixed bag in which millions and millions of Ukrainians died under various Soviet-driven policies. And I also wanted to talk we're almost to the end of my talk time, but I wanted to give a few minutes. I just wanted to talk about my impressions when I was serving in Ukraine. which again was from the summer of 2002 to the summer of 2005. That was when the Orange Revolution was happening. One of the things that really stuck me in the Orange Revolution, when in the few times that I was down among the crowds and talking to people, was the mood and just how joyous it was. It was as though people felt like, they had been pushed around by other countries, other people, by their own leaders. And this was just, the straw that broke the camel's back. They were being pushed around again. The election was being stolen. They weren't going to put up with it. But it wasn't really an angry mood. It was, they were proud of themselves for standing up for themselves. They were joyous. They felt like they were taking control of their destiny. And the mood at the protests was always was more like a party and a celebration. Rather than an anger. And then another thing that I think is important about the Orange Revolution that has resonance today is the way this was in the middle of winter. It was in December and January. It was freezing cold, and they kept 1 million people on the streets of Kiev for 2 months solid, up until the inauguration. And that is quite an undertaking in that kind of weather and quite a logistical challenge. And what they did at that very first day, they took over the trade union building. And as people were coming in, they were told if they wanted to help, they could go there, and they would go there, and people would be, they had sort of a rough organization of teams that they wanted, and people could be assigned to different teams that covered different parts of downtown Kiev, and they set up soup kitchens to feed people. They had medical teams. They had cleanup teams to clean up trash and garbage and deal with sanitation, because they didn't want the government to be able to cite health issues as a reason to shut them down. They had security teams that patrolled the crowds, make sure there wasn't any fighting. They had an alcohol ban, so they were making sure that there wasn't alcohol. They didn't want people getting drunk, didn't want people breaking windows or doing anything to disturb the peace. And they also had it set up so Kiev residents who were willing to host protesters that were coming from out of town could put down their name, and people that were looking for a place to sleep and get a shower and do some laundry and get dry socks could be hooked up with someone that lived there to get a break. Now, I say 1 million people, it wasn't the same 1 million people the whole time. People were rotating in and out. One example, somebody in our embassy talked to sort of a middle-aged woman in the crowd and was asking her, what her story was. And she lived about 80 miles outside of Kiev. She and her husband had a small farm, but they wanted to be part of the protests. And they agreed that they would split their time, and she would take the train into Kiev and spend 3 days at the protest and then take the train home to take care of the animals, and her husband would come in and spend 3 days at the protest. And their intention was just to rotate, having 1 day where they were both home and then 3 days each. And there were people coming in by busloads from cities all over, and they would come and they would spend a week and they would go home, and other people would come. But this kind of grassroots organization served them very well at that time. And I'm sure that they were using the same thing during the Maidan revolution. And I think we see that experience with that also when the invasion happened, and you saw sort of the grassroots resistance, organizing itself in this way. So I think that's a strength and a legacy that Ukraine has from those earlier, from the first peaceful Orange Revolution. And that's my time. And so I have here a suggested reading list. If you're interested, I will give this to the library, and you can check back with the library of some books on Ukrainian history. including one if you're interested in how Chernobyl and the environmental activism fed into sort of this nationalist movement that many people believe Chernobyl was the thing that sort of triggered off the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There's a book about that part of the history as well. And with that, I'll stop sharing and we can go to questions.
Necia, thank you. Covered a lot of ground in that hour. I just wanted to pop on and let folks know you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions directly to Necia, or you can go ahead and type them in the chat and we can read them off that way.
Gosh.
I think maybe you just covered it all.
Usually there's people are like, what about the Cossacks? What was that about the
start talking? Yeah. Necia, do you think that it is possible for Ukraine to maintain their sovereignty through all of this?
You know, it's a difficult question. I think everybody has been a little bit surprised about the extent that they've been able to do that, and the amount of trouble that Russia has had. Obviously, Russia, you know, has overwhelmingly larger military force. You know, partly I think it's gonna depend partly on how long the West is willing and able to continue to support Ukraine at the very high level that we have. You know, we have a little bit of an attention span problem. In some sense, it was sort of like, you know, very exciting and heartrending, but then now people are like moving on to the next thing. But I think it will continue to be hard. I think Russia has probably already rewound its ambitions and expectations of what they can achieve a little bit. You know, a lot of the big questions are, will some kind of end involve Ukraine ceding some territory to Russia or not, is a big open question. The Ukrainians are still not in a place where they're willing to agree to that. And you know, I don't know.
Is Donetsk, is it primarily people who want to stay with Russia? Because I've been confused about that. When you're,
it's really hard to say. I think at the time that the separatist things came out, those were kind of Russian astroturf. I mean, it was really Russians, but Russia has had media control of those territories. There's been a huge amount of internal displacement. Something like 2 to 3 million Ukrainians moved out of those territories while the fighting was going on, and most of those who left definitely didn't want Russia to be there. And people who were more pro-Russian were probably more likely to stay there than people who weren't. And it's also very difficult to poll that. And they've been having a lot of unrelenting Russian propaganda. I know I've seen some things from people who have left, but who have family members who remained there. And they say their family members have become completely brainwashed by the Russian propaganda. And they're sort of shocked and horrified that that's happened. So I think it's really hard to tease out what the inhabitants of those territories wanted. But But I'm fairly confident that before Russia began to invade and interfere, there was no grassroots movement that those places wanted to leave Ukraine and join Russia. That's something that's been created during the Russian occupation.
Thank you.
Necia, we have a question in the chat here. Where did the Ruthenians come from? It sounded like they just appeared in the narrative.
Well, as I said in the beginning, I showed that Kiev and Rus had over time between 10 and 12 sort of constituent principalities. One of those later principalities on the western side of Kiev and Rus was called Ruthenia. Ruthenia is a name that derives from Rus. And when after Kiev and Rus collapsed, and when because that was one of the farther west principalities, it was one of the earlier ones to be taken over by Lithuania and then to become part of Poland. And they just continued to apply that Ruthenian name to the people in that area, and eventually to everybody that had been part of former Kiev and Rus territories. So it was sort of like roughly, I guess, the former Rusins, the former people from Rus, were then Ruthenians thereafter, usually in the West. That was what they called Ukrainians.
Can you speak to Russia's accusations of Nazis in Ukraine?
There are Nazis in Ukraine, and there are Nazis in Russia, and there's Nazis in America, and there's Nazis in Germany. So everywhere has its own small fragment of Nazis. And the kernel of that Russian accusation is that when Russia went into Luhansk and Donetsk, and when the Ukrainian government launched a counter-military operation, the small Ukrainian Nazi group formed a battalion and offered itself to the Ukrainian government to fight against the Russians in that territory, and Ukraine accepted that offer. They were willing to take any fighters, anybody who wanted to fight the Russians. So it's not a large group. It's not beloved or important. It exists, and the Ukrainian government did accept them as part of their forces fighting against the Russians there.
I note that the material that Russia has been using in the conflict is not top shelf. It's previous generations of weaponry, like the BMP 1 and 2, but I haven't seen even one BMP 3. Why would Russia not go full force and do their best to win and get what they want out of Ukraine? I don't understand the Russian mind there. Can you elaborate?
This is really not an area of my expertise, and there's some really good military analysts. But my impression, I have to say I haven't followed all of this very closely, because I find it kind of hard because I have such strong personal feelings about Ukraine. But I'm reading some of the military analysis. People were surprised a bit by Russia's poor performance, because they believed that Russia had made a major effort to modernize a lot of its equipment and forces, and that hasn't really been evident. But I think the biggest suspicion is just the combination of incompetence and corruption means that, like a lot of things, they weren't very good, or they didn't work very well because money was skimped, or they weren't really bought, or it's hard to say. I'm not sure why they would hold it back, unless you know, it's hard to say with internal politics. Sometimes your fanciest things are things you're trying to protect. And that might be especially true because I've seen also that there's what they call kind of a major force shift, where it used to be tanks and planes and ships, you know, were your major military platforms that helped you win a war. But right now, the anti-tank missiles, anti-ship missiles, and anti-aircraft missiles are so effective is that all of those things are just targets. And that sort of shifted the momentum towards the defense, meaning that the defense can be more effective than the offense. And it could be that if they have things they've spent a lot of money on, they just don't want to send them out to be clobbered by an anti-whatever missile, because they've already lost quite a few things that way.
One more in the chat here, Necia. How can the Russian population get the truth?
It's tricky. A lot of ways that were available, you know, over time, the ways for Russians to get sort of outside information have been decreased, and especially since the war, that crackdown has been really tight. I think there's been an opposite effort again to feed information in and make it available. But one of the things about that, even if it's available, people have to want to find it and get it. And I think there's a question, at what point do you reach the point where you're like, do I really believe what I'm hearing? Do I want to look for an alternate source of information? So I think for people that want to find it, it's available, but I don't know how large a portion of the population is motivated to seek it. But clearly there have been large anti-war demonstrations in Russia, and there are quite a lot of people who aren't buying the line and who are horrified. I mean, one of the things I will say, Putin is not alone. I meant to say this and I forgot. Putin is not alone in his saying that Ukraine is an integral part of Russia and it's not a real country and Ukrainian is not a real language. That's pretty widely, I don't know if a majority of people hold it, but certainly a lot of Russian people hold that opinion. Even well-educated, sophisticated, cosmopolitan Russians. I cannot tell you how many times when I would meet a Russian and say that I'd served in Ukraine and lived and learned Ukrainian would tell me, Ukraine isn't a country and Ukrainian isn't a real language. You know, it's like, I just told them that I learned Ukrainian and they're saying, oh, that's not a language. Yes, it is. I learned it and I already spoke Russian and then I had to learn Ukrainian. But so there are a lot of people that just hold that view, and kind of surprisingly to me, but I guess it makes sense, a lot of ethnic Ukrainian Russian citizens, especially successful ones, hold that view especially tightly. And I guess, you know, they feel part of their success depends on their loyalty to Russia, admitting that, you know, Ukraine is a separate nationality would somehow make them foreigners in their own land. So that's not uncommon, but at the same time, even people who believe that Ukraine is part of Russia are horrified at the idea that they should be killing Ukrainians and bombing Ukraine because they do believe it's part of Russia. Why would you be, you know, making that kind of attack? So there's all kinds of different you know, aspects and complications to that.
Okay, we have two more questions here. How do you imagine this will all end? Is the first one.
I really don't know. I hesitate to project the future. You know, there's a whole range of possible outcomes, from, you know, this being, you know, kind of the nail in the coffin to Putin, for Russia doing a course correction and moving back in a more liberal direction, to, something where the West loses interest, Ukraine runs out of steam, and Russia's, population and military authority allow it to essentially take over much of Ukraine, leaving Iran. I suspect, it will land somewhere in between, where you see a long-term sort of stalemate, and maybe something similar to what's already been going on, which is sort of an ongoing small-scale fight in Luhansk and Donetsk, but maybe in a wider area. There are a lot of possibilities, and I hesitate to predict which one will actually happen.
And then this last one has a few pieces to it. What do you think would be some ways that Ukrainians would have in preserving their history or culture when so many have been displaced and cities destroyed? And how will culture change when many are coming back home from other EU states and their experiences abroad?
I mean, one thing I'm pretty sure of is, when I went to Ukraine in 2002, at that time, Ukraine had been an independent country for like 5 times longer than it had in its entire past history, if you didn't count Kiev and Rus. And so despite this long domination by other countries and partition by other countries, Ukrainians have maintained, their identity, they've maintained their culture, they've maintained their language. So if there's one thing that they have a lot of practice at, that's it, is maintaining their culture under pressure and under exposure to other cultures and entities. So as far as Ukrainian sort of culture, I don't have too many fears about it being squeezed out by this, when it wasn't squeezed out by any of those other things that happened to them. They also have a lot of experience at rebuilding things. One of the things that I said the first time I did this lecture, which I also haven't mentioned, is when I went to Ukraine, I just come out of my Ukrainian language course and also that Ukrainian history course. And when I got there, when I would walk around, Kiev, or walk around the countryside, this thought repeatedly would come to me that every inch of this country is soaked in blood. It has just been one long battlefield throughout its history. And even just in the last century, literally millions of Ukrainians were murdered on Ukrainian land. And yet, like their national anthem says, Ukraine persists. It has not yet perished. So in some sense, whatever happens, I think my sense is in the longer term, Ukraine will continue to maintain its identity, and this 30-year period of being an independent country, I think, has strengthened it, even beyond what it already had managed to maintain.
Okay, one more, and then I think we'll call it, just for time's sake, for this evening also. How would you characterize Putin, and do you think he is mentally deranged? Do you feel the Russian people and oligarchs are behind him?
I don't think he's mentally deranged in the sense of being like actually insane or crazy, but I think he is in that position that happens to people who are in positions of power and who hold on to that power through fear, where people are afraid to tell them the truth, and you get disconnected from reality because people don't want to tell you what's going on, because nobody wants to be the bearer of bad news. So I think he is in that place where his view of what he thought was going on is running into reality, and it isn't quite what he expected, and that people in that position don't have the best grasp on reality, not because they're crazy, but because they have warped the system around them such that they don't get the information that they need to perceive reality. I think Putin's support from the population has probably been eroding. I think the continued sort of crackdown on freedom of expression and dissent in Russia is a direct reaction to a loss of sort of popular support. And the oligarchs, you know, definitely supported him, not so much because they loved him, but because they knew which side their bread was buttered on. But they still fear him. I mean, he has no problem, you know, if you're on his side, he'll pass you favors. If you turn against him, he'll throw you in prison without a second thought. So I think they're beginning to see that he may well be more of a liability than a boon to them, but still not be in a position where they're able to oust him at this point. While the political, the sort of, at least the military, they still, you know, have a greater dependency on him in a way that isn't affected so much as the oligarchs by sanctions and other things that are happening.
Well, Necia, thank you so much for so much information and for this timely presentation.
Sure, I know it's a bit much. Like I said, it's kind of a forced march through Ukrainian history. And I also want to say I focused this on Ukraine's history with Russia, but they have an equally complicated history with Poland, with the Ottoman Empire, the Crimean Tatars. The whole religious and church history is its own thing. Whole history around Cossacks. So there's a lot of stuff. So if any of this was interesting, I really encourage people to have a look at one of those books to get a more nuanced and detailed picture.
Yes, and thank you for sharing that. And we'll definitely take a look at that and see what we can bring into the library. Well, thanks everyone so much for joining us this evening, and have a wonderful rest of your night.